The Labubu movie isn't just another quirky adaptation, it's the latest entry in Hollywood's obsession with turning pre-existing brands into cinematic universes. Sony Pictures has officially acquired the screen rights to Labubu, the Chinese toy line of fanged figurines that exploded in popularity over the past year. And here's the thing, I had never even heard of Labubu until South Park roasted it in the episode Walk is Dead. That's the hook. A toy line that was niche for nearly a decade suddenly becomes mainstream enough to warrant a feature film. But the real question is, can Labubu avoid becoming the Emoji Movie 2.0? Sony's announcement, reported by Variety, is still in its earliest stages. No producers, no talent, just a bet that Labubu's current hype will last long enough to justify a film. Labubu first hit shelves in 2015, created by Hong Kong artist Kasing Lung, but only recently became a pop culture fixation thanks to celebrity endorsements. Blackpink's Lisa literally called Labubu "my baby" in an interview, while NBA player Dillon Brooks showed up to a playoff game wearing one on a chain. That's the level of cultural penetration Sony is banking on. But hype alone doesn't guarantee a successful movie. We've seen this play out before, and the track record is mixed at best. Labubu now joins a long list of films based on brands rather than original stories. Barbie became a cultural juggernaut, the Super Mario Bros. Movie tapped into decades of gaming nostalgia, Flamin Hot dramatized the creation of a snack food, Unfrosted spun Jerry Seinfeld Pop-Tart bit into a feature, and the founder turned McDonald's into a cautionary tale about corporate ambition. Then there's the Lego Movie, which for all intents and purposes should not have worked, but somehow did. So much so that people were genuinely upset when Everything is Awesome was snubbed at the Oscars. On the other side of the spectrum, Playmobil the movie barely registered, the Angry Birds movie was forgettable despite having a sequel, and the Emoji Movie became shorthand for lazy brand exploitation. Labubu could go either way, and the difference comes down to whether audiences connect with the characters. This is where history matters. Mattel and Hasbro understood decades ago that toys alone weren't enough. Masters of the Universe and G.I. Joe weren't just plastic figures. They were Saturday morning cartoons designed to make kids fall in love with the characters first, then buy the toys. That emotional connection was the secret sauce. But when toy companies abandoned their core characters, retiring Duke in G.I. Joe the movie, killing Optimus Prime in Transformers the movie, or flooding shelves with obscure new figures while He-Man and Skeletor disappeared, they sabotaged their own success. George Lucas understood this perfectly. He refused to kill Han Solo in Return of the Jedi because, as he put it, quote, "there's no market for dead Han toys," end quote. That's the lesson Labubu must learn. Don't sacrifice the characters people care about for short-term novelty. And here's where the psychology comes in. Audiences don't just buy toys or watch movies. They form attachments. Think about Pikachu or Mario. These aren't just characters, they're emotional anchors. The same principle applies to Optimus Prime. When Transformers the movie killed him off in 1986, the backlash was so intense that Hasbro had to scramble. The outrage was so strong that when G.I. Joe the movie was set to kill Duke, they rewrote the ending so he slipped into a coma instead. Why? Because audiences weren't just buying toys, they were buying relationships. And when you sever that bond, you don't just lose a character, you lose trust. So here's the question. If Labubu doesn't build that kind of attachment, what happens when the hype fades? Do audiences really care about the brand, or do they care about the character? And this isn't just a toy problem, it's an MCU problem too. Marvel Studios created billion-dollar movies that brought millions of new fans into theaters, but those fans didn't become comic book readers. Why? Because when someone walked out of Captain America Civil War or Black Panther and went to the local comic shop, the books on the shelves were drastically different from the movies. Decades of continuity, alternate universes, and storylines that didn't match the cinematic versions made it nearly impossible for newcomers to jump in. If Marvel had truly wanted to convert moviegoers into comic readers, they would have launched a comic line directly tied to the MCU continuity. But they didn't, probably out of fear of alienating longtime fans who had been reading for decades. The result was a merchandising disconnect. The movie sold tickets, but they didn't sell comics. This is where the blind box model collides with audience psychology. Pop Mart's strategy fuels short-term excitement, but it undermines long-term loyalty. Fans want the Labubu they saw on screen. not a random variant they don't recognize. If Pop Mart refuses to make standalone figures of the movie's main characters, they risk alienating the very audience Sony is trying to build. And once that bond breaks, it's hard to repair. We've seen this play out in modern times too. Starting in 2023, Funko was literally dumping millions of unsold pop figures into landfills because it was cheaper than storing the overstock. Think about that. A brand that once dominated shelves with exclusives and variants driving collectors wild collapsed under the weight of its own overproduction. The landfill became the final resting place for Harry Potter pops, Disney pops, even Mandalorian pops. That's what happens when hype outpaces attachment. People bought them for novelty, not for connection. And when the novelty wore off, the figures became disposable. Labubu can't afford to become disposable. If the movie succeeds, Pop Mart has to pivot. Standalone figures of the film's characters must exist, or else Lafufu, the knockoff market, will fill the gap. Fans will settle for fakes if they can't find the real thing. And once Lafufu becomes the default option, Labubu loses control of its own identity. And here's another wrinkle in the Labubu story: the rise of the Lafufu. For those who don't know, Lafufu is basically the fake Labubu, a knockoff line that exists because demand for the real product is so high and supply is so limited that people will settle for the imitation. This isn't just a quirky side note, it's a warning sign. If Pop Mart refuses to make standalone figures of the movie's main characters, they run the risk of strengthening the Lafufu market. Fans will want the Labubu they saw on screen, but if they can't find it, they'll turn to whatever's available. And right now, that's Lafufu. And trying to shut down Lafufu is like playing whack-a-mole. You close one seller, 5 more pop up. That's the reality of popular collectibles. Pokemon cards have fakes. Old Game Boy, Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance DS, and 3DS cartridges also have fakes. The secondary market is full of counterfeits because the originals are scarce and expensive. Scarcity breeds imitation, and imitation thrives when official distribution fails. This is why Pop Mart needs to rethink its strategy. Blind boxes might feel hype, but they also feel frustration. If the Labubu movie succeeds, fans will want direct access to the characters they just connected with. If Pop Mart doesn't provide that, Lafufu will. And once knockoffs become the default option for casual fans, the brand loses control of its own identity. And Labubu isn't the first toy line to make the leap to film after fading into obscurity. Take Trolls in 2016. Most people forget that the movie was based on a toy line that started in Denmark in the 1950s. Okay, Troll dolls had their heyday in the US during the 1970s and 80s, but by the time DreamWorks released Trolls, the brand had all but disappeared from mainstream culture. The film barely broke even theatrically. It wasn't until it landed on Netflix that audiences really discovered it. Streaming gave Trolls a second life. That streaming success led to a Christmas special in 2017 called Trolls Holiday, an animated Netflix series that was Trolls The Beat Goes On, and later Trollstopia on Hulu and Peacock. By the time Trolls World Tour arrived in 2020, Universal leaned into that reality with a day-and-date release strategy. The film reportedly pulled in about $95 million in its first 19 days on PVOD. Revenue Universal didn't have to split with theaters. Trolls had proven itself as a streaming-driven franchise, so the pivot made sense. And when Trolls Band Together released theatrically in 2023, it was building on years of streaming-fueled momentum. The lesson here is clear. Trolls only became a modern hit because streaming gave audiences easy access. Labubu could face a similar trajectory. If the theatrical release struggles, streaming platforms might be the key to turning it into a cultural phenomenon. But that only works if the movie builds characters people care about. Without attachment, streaming won't save it. With attachment, streaming could amplify it, just like it did for Trolls. Labubu's path to success may also depend on whether it embraces its Eastern roots. Look at the recent success of Ni Jia 2. Before it was even released in the United States, the film had already become the 5th highest grossing movie of all time, not just in China, but globally. Sure, it didn't perform well theatrically in the US, but it didn't need to. Its cultural specificity resonated so strongly with domestic audiences that it became a phenomenon on its own terms. This principle isn't new. Back in 2001, Robert Rodriguez fought to make Spy Kids about a Latino family. The studio initially pushed back, worried that audiences wouldn't connect. Rodriguez's response was simple. You don't need to be British to enjoy James Bond. And he was right. The more specific you make it, the more universal it becomes. If you were a 2000s kid, no matter your background, you probably have nostalgia for those first 3 Spy Kids movies. In fact, Spy Kids 3D Game Over may have been the first 3D movie you ever saw in theaters. But cultural specificity doesn't always translate. Take Spice World in 1997. At the time, the Spice Girls were the biggest girl group in the world, but the movie was rushed during the peak of their popularity. While the group doesn't regret making it, the film leaned heavily into uniquely British humor, dry, self-referential, and steeped in cultural in-jokes. That style didn't resonate globally. International audiences often struggle with the tone because British humor doesn't always cross borders. The comedies that do best in the global marketplace lean into the language of clown, physical gags that transcend spoken language. Someone pulling down another's pants to reveal oversized boxers with red hearts, or getting slapped with a rubber chicken is universally funny. You don't need to speak English, French, Spanish, Chinese, or Swahili to get the joke. To be fair, Labubu probably won't lean into comedy. But Spice World is a reminder that cultural specificity can backfire if it isn't accessible. The challenge for Labubu is to embrace its Eastern identity while still finding a universal language, whether through character, emotion, or spectacle that audiences everywhere can connect with. And this brings us back to the bigger picture. Hollywood is in the middle of a toy-to-film boom. Studios are chasing brands because they believe nostalgia and novelty can replace original storytelling. But the truth is, not every toy line has the cultural foundation of Barbie or Mario. Trolls had decades of history even if it was dormant. Labubu doesn't. That means Sony and Pop Mart will have to work twice as hard to build emotional resonance from scratch. The stakes are higher than they look. If Labubu succeeds, it could open the door for more international toy brands to break into Hollywood. If it fails, it becomes another cautionary tale, proof that hype alone isn't enough. And unlike Trolls, Labubu doesn't have the cushion of a long legacy or a built-in nostalgia cycle. Its survival depends on whether audiences see it as more than a fad. So where does that leave us? Labubu is standing at a crossroads. On one side, it could become a breakout franchise, bridging East and West, toys and film, merchandise and streaming. On the other, it could fade as quickly as it arrived, remembered only as another collectible craze that couldn't make the leap. The difference lies in whether Sony and Pop Mart understand the lessons of history. Build characters, make them accessible, respect audience attachment, and don't let distribution or merchandising sabotage the brand. Because in the end, people don't remember the blind box. They remember the character inside. And if Labubu can give audiences a character worth remembering, then maybe, just maybe, it won't end up in the landfill of forgotten toy movies.